This is a prophetic word for all of America's ministers and church pastors. In fact, there are hundreds of ministers and pastors in Heisnear.com's own email database, and with over 700 churches and ministers, for example, just in one of Heisnear.com's Facebook groups. However, if you're a believer, then this will definitely open your eyes too about today's ministers across America. So if you're listening right now and you're a church pastor or TV preacher or holding yourself up in any way as a fivefold minister, meaning an apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, or teacher, then this word of the Lord is for you right now. And it's a radical and extreme word. But keep in mind, these are not my words, but these are the words of the Lord Jesus himself, and they're found already written in Matthew chapter 24, verse 45 through 51. And I'll say the bottom line right now of the Lord's prophetic word, which deals with end-time ministers who the Lord placed into two different profiles. The first group profiles a true minister who is faithful to God and to the charge given to that minister to oversee and feed the Lord's people. Of these the Lord said in verse 45, "Who then is the faithful and sensible slave, whom his master put in charge of his household, to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes." That's Matthew chapter 24, verse 45 and 46. Verse 47 states, "Truly I say to you that he," meaning the Lord, the master of the house, "will put him in charge of all possessions." On the other hand, the Lord had alarming words in the same passages for the second profile of end-time ministers. These were slothful and neglectful end-time ministers that were, quote, in charge of God's household. Jesus named them as evil. Why? Because these are end-time ministers who do not give God's children their food, nor at the proper time, like verse 45 requires. Of these end-time ministers, Jesus said, verse 48, "But if that evil slave says in his heart, 'My master is not coming for a long time,' and begins to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with drunkards, then the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour when he does not know, and shall cut him in pieces, and will assign him a place with the hypocrites. Weeping shall be there, and the gnashing of teeth." That's verses 48 through 51. Now the key factor which separated these end-time ministers into two opposing profiles was whether or not that minister was, quote, "giving my household," meaning God's children, the body of Christ, "their food at the proper time," as verse 45 states. What could be worse than not giving God's household, God's children, their food, than withholding it at the very time when they needed it the most, which is the proper time in Jesus' context? And this is precisely why the Lord labeled these self-serving end-time ministers as evil, because these ministers did not have God's children as their top priority. You know, every true man of God, called as a fivefold leader, will have two top priorities. One is to serve God, and the second priority is to serve and oversee God's children. But right now, today, is the exact proper time to give God's children their food. Jesus' words, "to give them their food at the proper time," could not be more relevant and urgent to any generation's fivefold ministers than to this generation right now. This is clear in view of the tangible nearness of Christ, and seeing all these things, as Matthew 24 verse 33 states, lined up on the world stage today in plain view, and as pinpointed at Heisnear.com. One of many verses for God's true ministers is Ephesians chapter 4 verse 12, which requires God's fivefold leaders who oversee God's children to equip the saints, not neglect the saints. So if you're listening right now and you're a pastor or minister who is one of the probably 98% of America's ministers who still have their head stuck in the sand when it comes to end-time prophecies, then it's time to wake up and cut out the watered-down sermons and put God's children first, and make sure you're giving God's children their food at the proper time. It's time for every fivefold minister to start readying God's people for what's coming, instead of playing patty cake with ear-tickling sermons, and to build your own reputation, and so you can gain the applause and approval of men. In fact, Jesus' words paint eternal consequences in Matthew 24's verses for this profile of minister. That's a terrible and sobering profile to stand before God in, as being a minister who failed to feed God's children their food at the very time when they needed it the most. This is not a rebuke, but a friendly but stern word of the Lord, and a word of warning and correction.